So today we have a couple of guests joining us. They're going to just come in, they want to learn more about the program and see how it functions. So when you see some new faces, that's who they are. And they might also, they're waving right now. And they might also pop into some of your breakout rooms. So just wanted to give you a little heads up about that. We'll have a regular schedule though. So the first part, we're just going to lead you through the introduction to multimodal assessment. Then we'll have a short break like normal. Then after that, we'll have our guest speaker, Caitlin Cornell, to come in and lead the discussion on the article that you read and on accessibility in foreign language learning and in assessment. And then at the very end, our illustrious guests would like to meet with you and just check in and see how things are going. So you'll have the last 15 minutes, you'll get to be with them. So anybody have any questions so far before we get started? All right, well, I'll give it to Paula to take it away.
All right, so let me pull up my PowerPoint. Sorry, technical difficulties, it's coming. I'm going to the screen share. And let me know, Liz and Dmitrii, if you don't see my screen. So let me share. And I think when we practiced earlier, it was popping up with the multimodal assessment screen. Does everyone see the green screen? Excellent. All right. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is multimodal assessment. And one of the things that we want to start with is like, why? Why do we want to have multimodal assessment in addition to the group orals that we did last week? And what we're trying to build upon is a expanded model of what speaking is. So a lot of applied linguists and people in educational measurement believe that the speaking construct itself should be expanded. So usually we think of language as having 4 skills: speaking, reading, listening, and writing. But we want to focus on performance assessment and have a multimodal integrated view of language and take steps back and don't think of it as 4 separate skills, but rather performance integrates all types of visuals. So speaking includes something broader than just speaking. It's a communication skill set, and it usually is multimodal. So how do people communicate? They speak, yes, but what do they do to make themselves understood? What do they do in informal settings versus formal settings? And what beyond voice do listeners use to understand? So I have, voice is just the audio, and it is very, very rare that people cover their eyes and listen or cover their eyes and speak. In the real world, we have visuals that help us with our comprehension. A lot of research is on how lips and facial expressions help people learn how to speak and how to comprehend listeners when they're listening, how to comprehend the person who is speaking to you. And we've seen this problematically in the pandemic times, where masks over language teachers' faces has hindered the acquisition process. And in particular, we've seen this in daycare settings where children are now developmentally behind because they're not picking up on many of the cues related to speech that help them process, helps them find word boundaries, and also understand a lot of the consonant differences, even between B, which you can see with your mouth, and ma, M, which you can also see with your mouth, to differentiate words, even at the beginning level. Gestures are an important part of communication. And also in academic settings, we use a lot of visual cues when we try to teach new concepts, and when we're using text and media to put together communicative acts to get our meaning across, we often have a very multimodal view on communication. So when we talk about multimodal learning, what we're talking about are different modes or different channels. So this is from a theory of learning called multimodal learning. It suggests that when a number of our senses, visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, are being engaged during the learning process, we actually understand and remember more. So if you are able to move around in the classroom, it keeps you physically alert, right? So helps you center your thinking, keeps you from getting fatigued. We see this in elementary education a lot. We want to bring that into the language classroom as much as possible. When we're able to touch and put our visual information together with our oral information, we're able to process at a higher level and have a better ability to retain. And even for adults, we've done a lot of research at Michigan State University on how captions help people process speech when they're listening to a movie in the foreign language, Arabic or Russian, that they're learning. It helps them find word boundaries and understand words that maybe if it was just the oral, they might not catch it. So it helps with something we call form meaning mapping, where we can map the form to the actual meaning of the word and helps us process. It helps us practice. So remember, our theory of second language acquisition is that it's through practice that people learn. And this is also a way of practicing multi-skills. So something that we want to do in this overall workshop is create multiple instances of measuring people's speaking performance. So some of the things that we want to be able to do is come up with the plan for each student. So let's say we have a student named Sally Oneida. And for that student, in the first 5 weeks of a language program, we want to get multiple instances of their speaking. And we want to get various perspectives on their speaking. So we might be doing things like group orals. So maybe in the first 5 weeks, I get, as her teacher, 2 instances of data collected from her group orals. So in week 1, I give her a novice low task. And in week 4, I try a higher task at novice mid. So you've designed some of the group orals, and we can use that to collect evidence of their speaking, spontaneous speech in a group setting. So what we're moving on to now are multimodal presentations, where the students have instances of preparing and rehearsing and practicing and then presenting to their peers. And we could get various instances of that too. Next week, we're going to start talking about self-assessments. So that's something that can also be given to students multiple times over the course of the semester. So when we think of the construct of speaking, what is speaking? It's all of these things put together. It's just different views or different lenses on the speaking construct. And each of these offers different opportunities to practice, spontaneous or prepared. What you will get is higher level speech. It's a little bit beyond what they can do by themselves. When we take, maybe some of you have heard of the zone of proximal development, that with support or with preparation, you can actually perform a little bit better. And if you're a believer in Stephen Krashen's I+1, that you learn by reaching just a little bit ahead of what you can do, this is also an optimal practice opportunity. So group orals for spontaneous practice and community building in your class, and multimodal presentations to get familiar with speaking in a group setting, getting comfortable with that, lowering your anxiety levels, getting to know each other in the classroom to make those optimal conditions for opportunities to practice your speaking in an environment that's safe and friendly and encouraging, right? Okay, so this is from Converse, correct? This is we were looking at your different cover sheets that you've already uploaded to the Google file, and some of you have put it up in Catalyst already. And remember, in the cover sheet, you had 2 goals in step 3. you are defining what your novice, what level your class will be at in fall 2021. So if everyone remembers that. And Converse said it was her class will be novice, mid to intermediate low. And then what she did next was identified the can-do statements for her fall 2021 course and what it is that they're going to be able to do at these various levels. So many of you did this already. Liz has given you some feedback on your cover sheets and your group orals that you've already submitted to the Google Drive. And what is listed here are 2 different can-do statements. And what I want you to do is just look at these and think about those 2 types of assessments that I just briefly overviewed. There's the group oral or a multimodal presentation. Can-do 4 and can-do 7, which one do you think will be for a group oral? Or could both? What do you think? Anyone want to volunteer? One could be a group oral, and I can't see everybody. Liz and Dima, if you see someone who's got their hand raised. Svetlana?
I think that 7 can definitely be for a group, especially, and students can read the story independently or together, and then all of them can contribute to who, what, when, and where.
Mm-hmm.
And 4 might be group, but because it's my classes and work activity, I think it's more students presenting yeah.
That's what we thought too. Yeah, thank you so much, Svetlana. That is exactly right. So what we're trying to do now is look at your goals and your can-dos in those bits of information and map them to the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, but then also chart them and map them to an assessment plan for your class. And I wanted to build on these 2 and show you a couple examples. So remember, this is novice, mid to intermediate low. It's a lower level class. So this is an example of a group oral based on number 4. Number 7. I can contribute to a conversation about a story by identifying who, what, where, and when. So this is a story completion task. It's a group oral where they get this picture. This picture is actually from a Spanish language textbook. And I took it out of there because I thought it would be really nice for the who, what, where, and when. So you and your friends are out to eat. You see 3 people nearby. Create a story about the 3 people. One of you should start by asking the others questions and then respond and build the story. Tell the story of who, what, where, and when. Take notes because then they'll write the story as a group the next day. So it's integrated skills. We're going to get them to speak in a group oral first and then build upon that and write a story about it at a lower level. So this, again, that is for the can-do number 7 that she pre-identified in the cover sheet. So looking at can-do 4, I can list my classes or work activities. This one is, we want to build on the modes of communication where we can do a task about this as well. So this is where we build on a multimodality. So this can be anything that communicates meaning in some way. Get your students to use pictures, illustrations, audio, speech, writing, graphics, print, music, video, captions or subtitles, gestures, facial expressions, all of these different things. In the group oral, they don't have all of these different modes of communication at their disposal. It's more spontaneous. But for the presentation, what we want them to do is practice. And this is because language classes have a diverse student populations with a wide variety of learning styles and needs. And a multimodal approach to both learning and assessment helps students achieve academic success in their own way and helps them show their best. So with this one, we want multimodalities of learning that leads to multiliteracies. And for speaking, it leads to multi-speaking abilities, that there's multiple pathways to practice. So remember, we talked in the very first session that learning to speak is a skill. It's like learning to play tennis or learning to play the piano. But you don't just make people play tennis all the time. You build up different muscles. You'll practice push-ups and you'll practice running. And these different things put together will make for the strongest tennis game, right? So the same thing with speaking. You want to practice it from all different angles. So for a multimodal presentational speaking task, thinking of what types of directions we could give for a low-level learner for the first year in a first semester or in the second semester is at that point in class, they are learning to get to know each other and they are learning vocabulary lists, furniture, shopping, or subjects in school. So making a very closed task that they have to fill out is a great way to get them to build a schema that they can use to base their presentation on. So this is an example where a teacher gives a student a PowerPoint template to fill out. They're supposed to give a list of their 5 classes and then also build in pictures from the internet and emojis. And then for the presentation, they will actually stand up for a minute or less and tell the classmates what their favorite, what their courses are and what their favorite one is. So these are the different class lists. So each student would fill out this chart for themselves in the target language and also find pictures on the internet to represent how they feel about the classes. And then also an emoji that they like to also show their feelings about the class. So what I'm going to do now, Liz has put in the chat a link to the, see if mine works, to the rubric for this task. So this is in your resources folder. You don't need to read through the first page because it's the same as I just showed you. So these would be the directions for a multimodal presentational speaking task that we could give to our students. You could translate this for higher level students into Arabic or Russian, but this, because it's at the beginning, we have it in English. And then we have example rubrics for this type of speaking task, different from the group oral. For the group oral, we only have the teacher assessing the students with the rubrics that we design. But this gives us an opportunity for peer assessment. So we have 2 different rubrics. The teacher has a rubric that they will use to try to fulfill the goals of the speaking assignment. And then the students also the students evaluate their peer as they present by having a rubric that they fill out for their classmate. So we've seen this in language classrooms in various ways. If it's face-to-face, these are papers. Oftentimes the teacher will cut out the peer cheer rubric and give the paper to the students to fill out. One of the goals at the beginning of the language class is for the class to become a community of practice, a social environment that's welcoming. So part of the goal is to learn each other's names and clearly be able to hear each other. So this is just one example of the rubrics that we're going to be leading you towards developing. And I'm going to turn over now to Dmitrii, who's going to take it from here. Any questions so far? Or Dima, do you want to go ahead and take over? I'll stop sharing my screen.
And I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share some sound. And I'm going to show you some examples of multimodal assessments. So can you see my screen? And I'm going to be switching between multiple screens, so I'm not going to make it into the presentation mode. So the examples that I want to show you, they come from the residential college in the arts and humanities at Michigan State. And these examples are publicly available on the college's website, so check it out. Very interesting stuff. So let's start with the first example. So this one is the project is called Places Unknown, Russia and Beyond. So the reason for this project is that students thought that everybody knows Moscow, St. Petersburg, balalaikas, Bears, blah, blah, blah. But not many people know about Uzbekistan, Vladivostok, Kalmykia, and Komi. So the places where they still speak Russian. So this is the project goal, and I'm just gonna show you the video right now. So this one is about Uzbekistan, just 30 seconds.
Привет, меня зовут Мэт, и это Узбекистан. География Узбекистана. Эта страна находится в Центральной Азии, и у нее 5 сухопутных границ. Площадь страны около 450 тысяч квадратных километров. Климат Узбекистана континентальный, но теплее на юге.
So this is Matt, and he's slide about the geography of Uzbekistan. So if you don't speak Russian, that's okay. So he's basically talking about the geography. So this is a classical example, I would say, of a multimodal assessment. So it's a recorded, narrated PowerPoint presentation. Students did some research on that beforehand. And this one is our second example. So the first one was a classical multimodal example, narrated PowerPoint presentation. This one is a little bit different. So the students in my Russian class, they wanted to try out some Russian dishes. And the project is called A Taste of Eastern Europe. And the video features 3 Eastern Slavic dishes, борщ, драники, and пирожки. And this video is available in the Russian, in the resources folder. Just want to check the chat. Yeah, and let me show it to you. It's very interesting, very unusual project.
Всем привет, меня зовут Мэт, и сегодня мы с вами будем готовить драники. Драники – это белорусская кухня, и это очень простой рецепт. Для драников нам нужно картофель, лук, мука, лимонный сок, соль и перец. И это все. Давайте начнем. Сначала мы чистим картофель и положим его в холодной воде. Сейчас мы трем картофель и лук.
So basically, they created a cooking video. So a question for you. 2 questions. What makes this example multimodal? So what are the modes used in this cooking video that the students, that my students prepared? What are some modes? Except for борщ. Борщ is definitely a mode in this video, but any other examples? Luke?
I mean, it's got kinesthetic because they got to perform these actions to create the dish, and as well as the visual of the elements that are in the dish. And I guess a mode that wasn't listed, I mean, we talk about the different senses, like olfactory. I mean, they're smelling, they're saying, you know, the word for potato, and they're getting that association in a way that I wish we could always get in the classroom, really.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great example. Any other thoughts, suggestions, comments? Yeah, thank you so much, Luke. So this is an interesting example. There's another mode, music. So they picked up, because dishes are from 3 regions, so they picked up regional music from Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Okay, so and there is another example for you. The project is titled Baklava. Students chose poems from prominent Arabic poets, and they also wrote a poem about baklava. I don't speak Arabic, so please let me know what you think. So this one is here. Okay, let's check it out.
al-Baklava. Uheb al-Baklava Shedun. Asan al-Halawiyat. Tabakat al-Falk wa-Tat. Bahuna Hashun Mutaz al-Jaus wa-al-Asar. Asan al-Halawiyat. Kul anas fishag al-Awsat ya kulunaha.
Sorry for interrupting you, and this looks delicious and sounds very interesting. This is another example of multimodal assessment from the residential college in the arts and humanities. Yeah, also about food. And when were working on this part of the presentation, we thought about STARTALK principles, right? So our program has principles. So, and it seems like just based on these 5 criteria, multimodal assessments, all of it. So it has backwards design. So you start with a big plan. So I want to do a cooking video, right? And you go back. What do you need to make this cooking video? It's performance. It's not a multiple choice test, right? So authentic materials, they're there. They conduct research in Russian. They watch videos about cooking and try to imitate it. It's learner-centered. So they picked up the topic. I'm just a facilitator helping them. And definitely this culture, content, and language, they go hand in hand. Yeah. So these are examples of multimodal assessment. Just last thing, so how can you integrate this type of assessment in your syllabi? So here at MSU, for example, we have, well, obviously speaking assignments, you can put it there, but we also have choice assignment. I know if your classes, Arabic and Russian classes, have some kind of a choice assignment on the syllabi. It means—
Oh, this one bigger, Dima?
Yeah, sure. And give me a second. Yeah. So it's a choice assignment. So they choose the topic, they can make a video, they can make a project, and they get their 10% of their final grade. So this is when it is possible to integrate it. So it's fun. So check out this website. It has many more examples, and Liz will show you more. And I'm done with my part. So Liz, if you want to start. I'm going to stop sharing. So Liz, you can go ahead. Start.
Great. Okay. So now we're going to get to the part where you guys get a chance to process this information. And what you are going to do is work in small groups, and you're going to practice making your own multimodal assessment. So in the chat, I've just posted, the link to a Jamboard. On the Jamboard, the first slide has 4 different descriptions of different multimodal assessments that were taken from the Residential College for Arts and Humanities at Michigan State. What I want you guys to do with your groups is to select one of those that you like as an inspiration, and you're going to create your own version of a multimodal assessment for your language and for your student age group. And you can be as true to the assessment itself, or you can differ from it as much as you want to. The only thing we want you to do is just use the Jamboard to give us an idea about what the assessment might look like, what your ideas are, and what you think the final product would look like. Welcome back. We're going to start the second part of today's session, which begins with our guest lecturer, Miss Caitlin Cornell. She is the Assistant Director of the Center for Language Teaching Advancement, which is a National Resource Center housed at Michigan State University. Simultaneously, she is also getting her PhD in the Second Language Studies program. So she is actually in the same cohort as me and Dima. So Caitlin has to wear a lot of different hats, but she does it amazingly well, and I'm in awe of her. So she has an MA in linguistics with a specialization in TESOL, but her primary research interest is in accessible teaching and learning written broad, and she's really interested in these issues of accessibility within second or foreign language teaching contexts. So I'm so honored to introduce her, and without further ado, please take it away.
Hi, everybody. Okay, I didn't want to do it earlier to mess anything up, but you're happy for me to share my screen now?
Yes.
I am here, as Liz mentioned, to talk about foreign language assessment accessibility for learners with disabilities. I want to preface this. I know we're running a little bit behind tonight. I have linked on these slides, and certainly Paula and Liz and Dima could give you my email address also, but I have linked to my website where you can contact me in a couple of different ways if you have continuing questions about this after the fact. And now we're going to jump right in so we don't lose more time. On this slide, I have what's called a GIF. It's a moving image, and it demonstrates how some learners with dyslexia might encounter reading as a classroom activity, or even when they're reading for pleasure. I do want to point out that we have several paragraphs in this GIF. So what you're seeing is the letters moving places in some of these words. And this is how reading can appear for, like I said, some students with dyslexia as a specific disability, but perhaps not all of them. Sometimes it happens a little bit differently for some students. And I've included this for you for two different reasons. The first, what I'm doing here by describing to you what you're seeing on the slide, this is modeling one thing that we can do for accessibility, making sure that the visuals that we incorporate in our presentations are also accessible in multiple modalities, right? And the other thing, or the other reason I do this, is because if you haven't had any experience with learners with disability or accessibility at all, this can give you kind of an idea of what some of the challenge might be like with language for learners with disabilities. And here's what we're going to do with the rest of our time, as time allows. And I will say that we can be flexible in our later stages if we need to end a little bit early. So in the acquire stage, I'm going to share with you some definitions of accessibility, accommodations, and universal design for learning. I'm going to give you a super brief legal history of accessibility in US education, pretty much just the stuff that it's helpful to know right now. And accessibility in two different contexts, because accessibility in higher education can actually be very different from how it manifests in the K-12 world. And then I'm going to give you an example of what common accommodations can look like, and also what universal design can look like in foreign language assessment. Okay, so we're going to spend, hopefully on the lower end here, about 15 minutes in the acquire stage. And again, I'm going to model for you something that I do to make my presentations accessible. On this slide, I have a screenshot actually of a very quick Google search that I did for the definition for accessibility. And there are three definitions on this slide, or on this screenshot, I should say. The quality of being able to be reached or entered. And to me, this reminds me of even the physical space of the classroom, being able to come into the classroom. For example, a learner who uses a wheelchair, if the elevator isn't working, might not actually be able to get to the classroom space. The next definition is the quality of being easy to obtain or use. And this, I think, reminds me most of something like a textbook that is only made available in print and not, for example, in an accessible PDF that could be read out loud by screen readers on a computer for people who are blind, or maybe an electronic version of the textbook. And the final definition is the quality of being easily understood or appreciated. And I think this definition is really the heart of what language teachers ought to know, probably, because there's also how to make content more accessible to learners with disabilities. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we continue. So accessibility, I think of accessibility as a general and umbrella term, and accommodations and universal design for learning are sort of two specific approaches that you can use, both of them together even, to get more improved general accessibility for students. Ideally, you always want to use a combination of accessibility, or excuse me, accommodations and universal design for learning. So both of those terms under general accessibility, and I'll explain why. Really important before we continue, it's important to know that making things accessible for students is never a process that's fully complete or finished. So we can provide each other with checklists, and that can help us remember the things to do. And that might make a situation much more accessible for one learner, but then there will be another learner who comes in with a similar but not quite the same disability, and we might have to make adjustments again. So it's really important not to think that we have to aim for perfect. We just have to really listen to our students, try to do what we can in each situation, and learn a little bit more each time we go, which is really not very different from most of what we do with teaching. It becomes an iterative process that we review just like anything else. So now we come to accommodations, and I'm going to give you here my definition of accommodations. I haven't taken this from anywhere else, so that's just important to know. I describe accommodations as the agreed upon modifications that a teacher would make in order to improve the accessibility of material, or maybe even an activity, for one student with a disability. For example, giving a student with a disability extra time to take a test is a common accommodation that we see in assessment, especially. Accommodations are usually arranged retroactively, and I really just mean by that you learn that you have a student with a disability in your class, and either you or they recognize that there's a challenge with maybe some material or an activity, and then you make a modification to fix it. So it really just means that you encounter the inaccessibility first, and then you come up with a solution. And I mentioned how that's done because universal design for learning is kind of done in the opposite way. It's an earlier process that you can use when you're actually designing things. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So universal design is actually an architectural concept wherein architects design environments to be as accessible as possible. Again, maybe not perfect, for as many users as possible. And the maybe slightly silly example that I often use is doorways that are usually designed at a standard height so that both short and tall and all the people in the middle can use that doorway. And universal design for learning is the same concept as UD, but it's applied to learning environments, and it's not limited to physical learning environments. It's not just about a classroom space. For example, more students would be able to access multimodal content. For example, content that has both a visual as well as an audio component, because students can access content more than one way. And that, for example, is why I narrate my slides that have visuals on them. Unlike accommodations, UDL can be used to anticipate how many, but not all, students will interact with the materials and activities before you even know for sure that you're going to have a student with a disability in your class. And one reason for that is because it's argued that universal design is actually good for everybody, not just learners with disabilities. So you can do it starting now if you want to. In the United States, accessibility is required by law. The US government must provide free and appropriate public education when we're talking about K-12 for children with disabilities. And that actually also applies to state-funded universities as well. And there are also laws that prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities in all educational contexts, including adults. At one time, US educators used to believe that the disability is something to be overcome, like a problem to be fixed. And it was mostly the student's responsibility to work really hard to fix whatever challenge they had to overcome that inaccessibility in their learning or even in a physical environment. But now we realize that it's really important for educators to help students succeed by making their classrooms and materials less effortful for them to use. So this is a really important change in the way that society and education view what the experience should be like for a learner with a disability. So it's now seen as the instructor's responsibility to work with the student, and in the case of K-12, also the student's family, as well as other support systems, for example, a disability services center, to help that student succeed. So now I'm going to talk just a little bit about the difference between K-12 assessment accessibility and what it's like in higher education, because they're very different. I will also say here that my experience as a teacher has all been in the K-12 realm. And while I have done a lot of research that's surrounding, did I say that oppositely? I have done more work in higher education and less in K-12. But I have interned with the Michigan Department of Education, and I've done a lot of research kind of around what accessibility looks like in K-12. So I just want to say that what I'm about to say next, some of you might have more experience having actually worked with than I have. And so I'd be really interested to talk to you more about that maybe. So in K-12, there are mandated supports, and it's very structured. So there's individual education plans and 504 plans that determine what kind of support an individual student needs, depending very specifically on the challenges that they face in their learning, depending on the disability. And those typically translate to their assessments as well. Sometimes also in education systems, there are pull-out arrangements for students so they can leave their classrooms for additional support depending on what the disability is and depending on what the school district might offer. Very often though, teachers will provide as much as they can and as much as they're trained for differentiated instruction and scaffolding for learners with disabilities who are in their mainstream classes. So sometimes the students leave for support, but sometimes they stay where they are and the teachers try to do their best, sometimes with training, sometimes not. So it's very, very different in higher education. There's no mandated IEP or 504 support for students with disabilities in higher ed. So the support that they had in K-12 does not transfer to their new learning context. Many students then decide to opt out of the undergraduate language requirement completely. And the students who don't opt out still may or may not choose to register with the Disability Service Center on campus. And there are many reasons why a student wouldn't want to do that. I'm not going to take a lot of time to go into that now, but if you were to do a quick Google search, you might not find research, but you would find some of the popular reasons why students don't want to disclose their disabilities. But even if they don't register, it doesn't mean that they don't need support in order to be more successful in the language classes. I'm going to go ahead and pause here, even though I know that, time is of the essence this evening, and just check and make sure that nobody has any questions before I move on to this sort of next section of this phase. It looks like maybe Irina has a question.
I do, and I'm sorry again if this is kind of to take you off the track of what you're talking about.
That's okay.
But when we talk about accommodation for students, do we ever talk about how teachers who might themselves have some of these issues come up for them can disclose or not disclose or otherwise manage the classroom in a different way? I'm curious about kind of both pieces of this and how it.
That's a great question. I will say very quickly, this is one that we'll save too, but the very quick answer to that is it's something that I think don't talk about enough probably. Maybe not, we maybe don't need to have them in the exact same conversations like in a workshop like this, but I think that in higher ed at least, we aren't often enough talking also about what faculty might be needing, especially if they have disabilities. So you're right to ask that question. It's a question that other people are also asking. And I hope that we can come back to that one. I'm writing these down. I promise I have notes here and I'm adding them. Okay, we're going to continue for now, but I'll pause again in a couple more slides for some additional questions. Okay, so generally the type of accommodations that are useful for assessment depend on a student's need relative to their disability. Choosing appropriate accommodations should be a conversation with the student and disability support services if possible. There are a few situations where you and the student might come to an appropriate agreement about something that's easy for you to do for them, but ideally you want to have a lot of people in the conversation. But my point here is that it's not really up to the instructor to decide for sure what's going to be useful for the student. It really has to be a two-way conversation because certainly the student knows their disability the best. And so the instructor knows the curriculum the best or the assessment the best. And when you come together, you can usually find a compromise that works for both pieces. Ideally, accommodations for assessment will be the same accommodations that teachers use for the student in their classroom practices too. This applies mostly to K-12. And I will give you an example of what I mean by that. If a student has a note taker in class, usually they should, in theory, be able to use a note taker during the test. And I will say this with one little caveat. When I interned with the Michigan Department of Education for the Assessment and Accountability Office, this is something that I learned from the woman that I was working with there. And their office is incredibly explicit with teachers about the fact that if a student uses this accommodation in class and it's on their IEP or their 504, then they need to be able to use that for the assessment. I can't speak to how well that's articulated, how clear that education departments always make that in other states. But there's a reason why we say that. And the reason is students really shouldn't have to learn how to use a brand new tool when they also have, this anxiety of taking a big high stakes test, for example. This is easier, or let me say, teachers have a little more control over this when we're talking about classroom assessments rather than, those large state mandated tests. But I do want to say that at least the Michigan Department of Education knows that that's a thing that they need to be careful about. So that's good to know. And here's a list of I think the most common accommodations that we would see in assessment. The number one biggest one is extra time. And I think that this one's really important because for a lot of disabilities, it really does just take extra time to read something or process something. My only word of caution with this one is that I don't think we just want to overuse the assessment or the accommodation, of extra time without making sure that it's actually helpful to the student. And this is where I say we want to have conversations with the student to make sure that they're getting something that's useful and helpful to them. Of course, balancing that with what's necessary and appropriate to make a fair and reliable assessment. Frequent breaks are also, I think, important for students with disabilities. A quiet and private place to take a test that might be free from distractions could be helpful, certainly for disabilities like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. A place that's free from distractions could help students concentrate much easier. Often in K-12, human test readers can help to either read questions or directions aloud to students, and then the students will answer. They also might have human assistance for typing or for note-taking during assessments. Sometimes there will be assistive technology like a magnifier. And in some departments of education, depending on how they've written their support documents, sometimes there are extra supports that are also allowed in sort of a state mandated test situation. For example, maybe a student would be allowed to have a highlighter, or sometimes they might be allowed to have a ruler with them to help them read line by line. So there are other things that are just sort of regular items, but they could be really helpful to a learner with a disability, depending on what the challenge might be for them in test taking. Sometimes also offering a transcript or captions on audio material, even if it's a listening assessment, there might be times that that's appropriate. For example, I don't know if I have a good example. We might have to come back to that one for an example, but it is possible that maybe there could be a reading prompt and then they only listen for multiple choice options and they have to choose the multiple choice option. It depends on what the learning outcomes or what the goals are, or standards, for example, in K-12. It depends on what standards are being tested. Okay, now we're moving into UDL, Universal Design for Learning for Assessment. And remember that UDL is different in the sense that, well, in a couple of different ways, but in the largest sense, that you're doing it in the design process rather than after the fact. So with accommodations, there's already an assessment, and then we're figuring out how to make it a little bit friendlier to learners with disabilities. But in this sense, we're considering what types of students might interact with this assessment, and then we're designing it based on that audience that we're trying to predict. So here are some questions that you want to ask yourself when you're designing assessments. What do your learning outcomes tell you to assess? What information can you provide in multiple modes? If anything's provided in only one mode, are you sure it has to be that way? Maybe it does. But if you go back to your learning outcomes, you might be able to decide. For example, if you're only assessing speaking skills, then in theory, the students should be able to access the prompt, if there is one, via either reading or listening, or even both. That shouldn't probably affect their speaking outcomes, right, on that assessment. If you're assessing listening skills, then adding alternative text or alt text, which is just a text description attached to an image for someone who's blind or visually impaired who might not be able to see that image, adding alt text shouldn't matter to the assessment if, again, you're assessing listening outcomes. Can you assess this learning outcome in more than one way, maybe via dynamic or alternative assessment? And just a quick example, maybe a portfolio might be a less pressurized way for students to show their learning. Again, it depends on what you're trying to assess. What flexibility can you build into the assessment? Maybe you can give all students, regardless of disability, a flexible amount of time, or maybe the assessment doesn't even need to be timed. Maybe it does, but this is a question that you can ask. Can you change the assessment type next time? Maybe this time the students do have to do a timed multiple choice assessment, or maybe they have to write an essay, but maybe next time they could create a video. And if you create flexibility in this way or variability in this way, maybe this assessment will be hard for them, but next week's would appeal to their strengths better than something else. So you don't always have to be flexible in one assessment. You can try for flexibility over the course of a term or a year. What practice might be helpful to any of your students? And also what kind of practice might be helpful explicitly for various disabilities in particular? Lots of repetition, really explicit directions. Usually those things are good for everyone. So it might not be a difficult thing to implement for learners with disabilities. Being able to practice definitely makes me feel better, even if I don't have anxiety about the test. What kind of support might be helpful for any of your students? For example, many people like captions on videos, even if they're not hard of hearing. My son, who just learned to read, loves the captions because he can show off all of his reading skill. Here's a quick note about fairness. And fairness is an official construct within larger research about assessment, but really here I mean it in a very micro, small, local way. It's important not to ask students with disabilities to do anything that they can't do in their home language. And I'm going to give you an example of this. If a hard of hearing student reads lips to help them understand in their home language of English, then they should also be able to read lips to help them in their foreign language listening assessment also. The easy solution to this would be to use video clips instead of audio clips. Now, this one's a tricky one. But I will say, this isn't just Caitlin telling you that this is a good idea. This is another concept that I got from my time in the Michigan Department of Education. And that assessment office also believes that in terms of fairness for assessment, it isn't fair to ask someone who relies on lip reading in their everyday life to now not have that ability on a foreign language assessment, or in this case, an English language assessment when I was working with the MDE. So you may not always be in control of this because you weren't the one to design the test. I understand that. This is just something to keep in mind when you do have the control of designing your own. Okay, we have reached the time where it looks like I have a question. So I'm going to answer a couple questions first, and then we'll head into our first breakout room activity. Go ahead if you have a question.
Hey, Caitlin, thank you so much. I just had a case this past semester where I had a student with a disability, and they requested for closed captions to be added to the videos that I post on Blackboard. And the problem turned out, because I teach Arabic, the problem was that I could not add, I had to manually add closed captions for Arabic, just because it's just not available for Arabic, the closed captions, the automatic ones. And so I was wondering if there are any ways to figure out like a solution for a problem like that, because I ended up having to add closed captions to all of my videos just manually. And then that was for the videos. And then for the assessment, I did that as well, just because we're talking about listening and speaking here for the assessment part. So it ended up being, for the listening part at least, it wasn't a listening assessment anymore, just because I had to add closed captions in a foreign language, which is Arabic. So that ended up not being an assessment. And then, well, eventually what happened, unfortunately, was that the student could not pass the exams and they had to drop out. So until now, I haven't yet figured out how to solve that kind of problem when it comes up again, if it comes up again. So if you have any ideas, or if any of the other instructors have an idea on how to handle this kind of situation in the future, that'll be helpful. Thank you.
Great question. And anybody who has any ideas should feel free to chime in. The couple of things that come to mind right now, and I don't know enough about the videos that you were trying to use to know that these would actually work for you, but just hearing what I heard, my suggestions would be, I wonder if it would be appropriate to do a transcript for that one student of the video rather than closed captioning on all of the videos. I don't know if a transcript, depending on what documentation there was, I don't know if a transcript would actually achieve what the learner needed in that moment. So that's a conversation between you and the student and whatever support services you also have. And unfortunately, I don't have good solutions for closed captions that aren't readily available. The only other thing I could think of, and this has a whole host of other problems with it, is finding videos that already have captioning done on them. But of course, that's very tricky when you have very specific things you're looking for in clips. So I understand that that's not really a very helpful solution, but often I try to tell people wherever you can, recycle material that already has all of the accessibility components, because it will cut down on a lot of time for you. But I recognize that that makes for clips that aren't maybe perfectly tailored for your needs for the assessment or for classroom listening clips.
Mona, there is playaling.com. I don't know if you know that resource. I can put it in the chat, but that is a bank of captioned videos. Just putting it out there in case other people want it. No, thank you, Mariah.
Caitlin is also writing that down. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
Liz, is that just for Arabic? Did you know if
that is just for Arabic? Unfortunately, I'm sorry, Russian speakers.
I used YouTube for this purposes, so I uploaded it to my account, and then YouTube automatically generated subtitles for me, so I could, for free, just copy the subtitles. But I edit them, usually just edit them to the notes in my presentations. That's what I did. So the things that I said, I just put it in the notes under the slide. So.
And Dima, that works with Russian, the Google or YouTube.
YouTube works with Russian, yes.
Another technology tool that does that is Microsoft Stream, which is very much like Google's YouTube. And it also you upload a video and it will automatically generate the captions. I've done it with English and German, but I've not done it with Arabic or Russian, but that's another tool. And the technologies are developing rapidly. So if it's not available in your language yet, it will be soon. So it does sound like YouTube is working, and if any of you have experience uploading novel content to Google Stream or Microsoft Streams or YouTube, and if that works in other languages.
So one small little point of distinction: closed captions are not actually the same thing as subtitles, technically, when we're talking about the hard of hearing. So closed captioning also includes audio that's not just spoken, like there's wind through the trees, or there's some other sound like traffic and things like this. I don't believe that YouTube and other AI will pick up those things. So if you're talking about subtitles, there are quite a few more options, and I'll add to this wonderful list we have going. Apparently, I have not used it yet, but Microsoft Word apparently has really, really good AI for this now, like better than the Zoom captioning that you're seeing in this lecture right now. So I would add that to your list as well. And I would say, without being the ultimate expert on every student's experience, certainly, subtitles are probably what students are really relying on, although it's true that closed captioning would create certainly a more inclusive experience for them. But for the sake of assessment, probably subtitles would be all that you would need. I think then we're going to continue on into process. Who's going to create my breakout rooms for me? Okay, Liz, so I will give you the signal when I'm ready. Okay? don't start this precipitously. I have directions. Okay, so we're going to do an activity now. And Liz is going to put you in some breakout rooms in a moment. But first, I'm going to give you some directions. And then I'm going to direct you to the slide that has the thing I want you to discuss on it, okay? So first, the directions. Liz is going to add you to a breakout room in a moment. And with other colleagues of yours in that breakout room, I'd like you to discuss something, which I'll show you on the next slide in one moment. You're going to take notes in a Jamboard, which I think Liz will probably chat you the link to. Awesome. And then when you return from the breakout room, please share your group's ideas with the rest of us. And now I'm going to go to the thing that I want you to discuss. Wait, do we have any questions about the directions? Breakout room, discuss, take notes, then come back and discuss with everybody? Sounds good? Okay. So here's the prompt. What design elements of, for example, a group oral assessment do you think might be challenging for learners with disabilities? I want to say that it's always best in the actual classroom to learn this from the students directly or by doing even a little bit of Google research about certain disabilities. But today it's perfectly fine to just guess for practice. It's okay that you don't know a lot about what disability because you don't actually have a student yet. That's fine. You could consider the following disabilities. You do not have to consider all of them. You can decide as a group what you have time for. Blindness, oh, and also Mona and others, when we were talking about pronouns and terminology, this is the slide that gives you good examples of how you want to write these things out when you're describing disabilities. So blindness or visual impairment, deaf and hard of hearing, processing or learning disorders like dyslexia, but remember, they're not necessarily always just reading, they can be auditory also. Autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, anxiety, and then this is where I included the little note about that sometimes you might hear people say hearing impairment, but from people who are hard of hearing or deaf, they prefer the deaf or hard of hearing label. Also, it's possible that there are certain individuals who have different preferences beyond what the larger group does. So it's important to know that also. Okay, Liz, we're ready.
Hi, Irina.
Hi.
Welcome back.
Yeah.
Did we jump the gun?
No, not at all.
Okay.
No. Yeah, no, everyone has 60 seconds to join, and some people are at a spot where they're ready to come back, and other people like don't see it until so.
Please, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
So can you tell us in advance what technology we're going to use next time? Because I know about Jamboard, I have never used it. And it takes time to figure out how to work with that. You know, just like in advance, okay, guys, next time we're going to use Google Drive or blah, 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 something, so that I will be ready.
That's a very, very reasonable request.
Yeah, because it's just wasting time. We're trying and sitting to figure out how to click what to do. So, but yeah, I'm familiar, but I never used it.
Yeah. We would be happy to do that in order to try to save time. I mean, I don't want you to feel like you need to master the technology.
No, just we can do that at least just to have an idea. There are a lot of tutorials, but like for Wednesday, we're going to use like something else, or that's it.
Okay, of course, I'd be happy to do that. No, thank you for asking.
Yeah,
I'm going to give the floor back to Caitlin.
And I'm going to give the floor to everyone else. So I would like to welcome anyone who wants to share anything that their group talked about or any questions that you have. I'm not going to obligate all the groups to share, partially because I want to save time, but also because this is another accommodation that I often offer in my classes. I don't force people to contribute to all of the pieces of the class necessarily, in case they have anxiety.
I can go.
Sure.
Okay, so one of the big concepts that we personally focusing on when I have the assessment or create assessment for my students is to differentiate their levels. So differentiation in their academic, differentiation in their ways of learning, their personality. So, and giving also them the voice and choice to just choose what they want to do.
Voice and choice. I love that.
Yeah. So, like creating assessment, like we were talking about, if I have something like specific, I need them to do the oral, maybe conversation. So, giving them the choice to work with a partner, grouping them based on their level. So I can't put someone who have like a high speed of talking with someone who's still like starting to communicate, or someone who have an anxiety. Also like differentiation in the rubric. So when I create the assessment, I have the rubric for the advanced students and the other rubric for the like beginners. because my expectation for it's different for both of them. So if I have the same rubric for everybody, it is unfair for the advanced because my expectation will not be high or my standards will not be high for them. And also it's not fair for the beginners. So creating different rubrics and handle it to each one. So each one has a rubric. They don't know what's inside the other, the rubric for the other students. So for example, I need them to create a conversation. Maybe for the advanced it will be 10 questions. For the beginners, maybe it will be only 3 or 4. Also the depth of the questions, also everything will be included in my rubric. So I think at that, maybe with this differentiation, I will try to just move some of the challenge from anyone with with any disability. Because not with it's as I said, it's not only with the language teacher, it's even with the art teacher or math teacher. I have students they are very well in writing. When I ask them to write, they are doing very well, but the others maybe they like to draw. So when you give them the option, this is something very good. So give them a choice, I need you to do this topic or this theme and choose your own way to express it or to just to do it. So
thank you so much for sharing. That's awesome. That was really great. I don't know if you know this, but in case you didn't, the way that you offer choice is very much a part of universal design for learning. Giving students the option to choose the way to demonstrate their learning is one of the things that universal design for learning calls for. Well done.
Thanks.
Does anyone have any questions or would like to share? Maybe just a couple more minutes, and then I'm going to wrap us up pretty much.
I have a colleague who has students in her language class, I think an Arabic class, with auditory processing disorders. So it takes them longer to understand what they're hearing and also formulate a response. And one of her accommodations is that she has asked her entire class that after they say something or ask a question, everyone takes 2 breaths before anyone can respond, which gives the student with the processing disorder the time that they need, but also all of the other students some time to really think about their answer.
That's really great. And even if they weren't trying to formulate an answer, a lot of people say that smaller chunks of audio at a time are easier to process. So even if there wasn't speech coming next, frequent breaks like that in audio processing are really helpful. That's a great example. Thanks for sharing that one.
So, Caitlin, we need to
wrap up.
Over. Yes.
Yes, no problem. Here we go. So I just wanted to share with you, there we go. We're going to skip this section because of time, and that's okay, but I wanted to just tell you what's here in case you want to do the extra practice on your own. Totally optional, okay? What I was going to have you do next was try to create a basic design for a group oral assessment that's universally, I'm using finger quotes, universally designed to address some of the potential challenges for 3 different learners that you might have. And I was going to have you think about potentially a processing disorder like we talked about, an anxious student, and someone who might be hard of hearing. And a big hint here, incorporating multimodality can address a lot of the challenges that these 3 types of learners might have. So again, we don't have time to do that now, but I wanted to share that with you as an optional activity for later. And remember, for this and other things, you're not trying to design the perfect assessment for every single student. The goal, especially for us discussing tonight, was just to try to get in the habit of thinking proactively about disabilities when you think about your assessments. The rest of my slides were just extra resources for you, some about general accessibility, some about higher ed and K-12, and some that are K-12 only. And that is it from me. Thank you so much for having me.